A good starting point for attempting to understand Islam is to begin with the Bible. Now that may seem strange, but let's consider what Christians believe about the Bible. Christians believe that the Bible is the Word of God, but it is the Word of God that is inspired by God. So the Bible was given by revelation of God through men who spoke in their own words. And as you read the Bible, you find many different types of literature. You find poetry, you find history, you find letters. And all of these use different vocabularies. Different ideas come out in the Bible. You get the temperament of St. Paul coming through in St. Paul's letters. You get the temperament of Jeremiah or Isaiah coming through in the books of Jeremiah and Isaiah. There is the intermixture of the human and the divine, because God speaks through humans. The Bible is the Word of God, but it's the inspired Word of God. This is a very different way of thinking about revelation to that found within Islam. For Muslims, the Quran is not the inspired Word of God. For Muslims, the Quran is the Word of God. It is the literal Word of God. God caused Muhammad to recite his words. He didn't simply inspire Muhammad to talk like a biblical prophet. When Muhammad recited the Quran, he was reciting the words of God exactly. Therefore, the language within which the Quran is written, Arabic, is the language of God. And this is an important feature of Islam, because in Christianity, the Bible can be translated into other languages and it remains the Bible. It is still the Word of God, whether it's in English or German or French or Swahili or Chinese. But the Quran doesn't remain the Quran when it's translated into another language. The Quran is in Arabic, and Muslims must learn the Quran in Arabic if they are to really come to grips with the Quran and the beauty of its poetry. But to help explain the Quran, Muslims have often translated or given a rendition of the Quran in another language. It's not really a translation as we would understand a translation. Marmaduke Pickthall, who created a British convert to Islam, who made a rendition of the Quran, said very carefully, this is not a translation. My book is not a translation of the Quran like the Bible is a translation, or the King James Bible is a translation of the Hebrew Bible. My book is a rendition of what the Quran implies, what it says or attempts to say. I can't translate the Quran. The Quran can only be read in Arabic, but I can give people some insight into the meaning of the Quran. And therefore, the title of his book is The Meaning of the Glorious Quran, not the translation of the glorious Quran. So we've got to be careful here, because there is a different mindset in viewing revelation, in viewing the nature of revelation, and how we approach these religious texts. Christians can study the Bible and they can argue about it. They can look at a text and they can say, did Jesus really say this? Or did some scribe make a mistake at a later date and this got entered into the text? We can look at the Synoptic Gospels, and I've talked about this earlier, and we can say, look, there seem to be dependencies. There are similar passages in these Gospels. What does it mean? You can't do this with the Quran. You can't have a Quranic criticism as you can have a biblical criticism, because the Quran is the direct word of God. So we have to think of the Quran, and this is an analogy, and I hope if any Muslim hears this, they'll understand what I'm trying to say. But the Quran is rather like something that we hear over the radio. When you turn on your radio, and you hear the voice of the American president or the Queen of England or some other great figure speaking, you're hearing their words through the medium of the radio. When a Muslim reads the Quran, they read the word of God through the medium of writing. And it is God who is speaking directly to them through the writing. So this is an approach to the Quran this is an approach to revelation that we need to take very seriously. An approach to revelation which is different. And it also means that when it comes to things like Bible studies, you don't have the equivalent in the Quran. Muslims learn to recite the Quran, they memorize the Quran, but they don't study the Quran in the same way that Christians study the Bible. What Muslims do is study what's known as the Hadith, and the Hadith comprises of the acts and sayings of Muhammad. And about the Hadith, which are inspired statements, they're recorded acts of Muhammad, they're recorded statements of Muhammad which are inspired by God, Muslims can argue. They can question whether an hadith is authentic or not. And when Muslims look at the hadith, they ask who recorded it, which of Muhammad's followers wrote this down, and were they reliable? And does this hadith jive with the rest of the hadith? Does it agree with the Quran? Muslims can ask lots of questions about the hadith, but they can't ask questions about the Quran itself. The Quran was finalized by the Caliph Uthman or Omar, who brought together all the extant copies of the Quran, and where there were any variations, where people had written differences, a decision was made over which were the authentic ones, and all the other renditions were destroyed. So that there is only one text of the Quran. You don't have variants in the Quranic text. And this again is an important fact to recognize. One can go on the internet and you can find Muslim websites and other websites that describe the composition of the Quran and the Hadith in detail. Because the Quran is believed to be the revealed word of God for humankind, the Quran is also believed to govern every aspect of life. The Quran and the Hadith, which expands upon the meaning of the Quran, govern everything that a person does. It governs social relationships, it governs business relationships, it governs anything you can think of. Everything comes from the Quran. And the task of Muslim scholars is to interpret this, because clearly as Muslims moved into different parts of the world, different questions came up. They encountered different circumstances, and they asked the question, how do these revelations apply in this circumstance? And therefore the great law schools of Islam grew up to interpret the law, because Islam is a religion of law. And this is why there is often a debate about the nature of Sharia law in Islam. Sharia law is a law that is derived from the Quran and the Hadith, and it applies to daily life and governs the lives of believers, but also Muslims believe that it ought to govern the lives of non-believers as well, because everyone ought to obey God, and obedience to God is the key message of the Quran. Human obedience to God. And humans aren't believed to be able to make decisions on these things. God has told them what to do, and they must obey. Whereas by contrasting Christianity, we see that Jesus tells people, he lays down principles that each individual must apply to their own lives. In Islam, life is in some ways simplified by the law, because the law doesn't leave room for doubt. It tells Muslims how to act under any circumstance. And this is both a strength and, for an outsider, perhaps a weakness of Islam itself. When we talk about what the Quran means, we need guidance. We can't simply read the Quran like we can read the Bible, because the Quran needs the Hadith to interpret it. It's the revelation of God, but it isn't always clear what the meaning is or how it applies to life, because it was written in a very different society to our own. So there is a Muslim tradition, or there are Muslims' traditions of interpretation, and it's important for people to know those traditions. It's also important to distinguish which surahs, that is, which sections of the Quran, are more important than others, because certain ones are more important than others. And in fact, generally, Muslim scholars believe that Surah 9 is the surah that controls all the others. It's the one that lays down the principles by which the rest of the Quran is to be read. Now, some Muslims disagree about this, and there is argument in the Muslim community about how this should take place. But nevertheless, one has to learn how to interpret the Quran in a way in which Christians don't learn to read the Bible. Christians pick up the Bible and try to interpret it. And there's nothing wrong with that. There are commentaries and there are other things, there are scholars who help, but the scholarly interpretations are never taken as fundamental. They're never taken as necessary for the believer. The ordinary believer is thought capable of reading the Bible and understanding it and applying it to their lives. But the Quran needs to be interpreted for the believer. And it's interpreted through the community of Muslims. And this is the importance of the community. A very good introduction to this is Michael Cook's book, The Quran, A Very Short Introduction. It's a very short little book, but it's really quite wonderful in the way in which it brings together the understanding of the Quran by Muslims for non-Muslims. And it gives real insight into the means of interpreting the Quran that are used by Muslims. Some people may think, well, if the Quran is to be interpreted by the Hadith, why can't I just go away and read the Hadith and then I'll know what the Quran is teaching? The problem with this is there are so many Hadith and there are so many arguments about which Hadith are authoritative and which aren't. Muslims have huge collections of Hadith, and Muslim scholarship has spent centuries interpreting and understanding and arguing about the Hadith. So again, the believer needs guidance. And this is the role of the scholar within Islam, to interpret the Hadith so that the Quran itself may be understood and interpreted in daily life. The Hadith is very complex. And this is something which one has to really recognize. One needs to know who wrote it, when it was recorded, what were the circumstances. All of the tools that we would apply to biblical criticism are applied to the criticism of the Hadith, which makes it difficult to simply read. One other issue that comes up in looking at Islam and the question of revelation is, what is the relationship between the Bible and the Quran? Muslims claim that Muhammad is the last of the prophets and that his teaching is in line with biblical teaching. God revealed himself through the Hebrew Bible. God revealed himself through Jesus. And Muhammad completes this revelation, and God speaks to mankind through Muhammad. But does this mean that we can appeal to the Bible in discussing with Muslims the meaning of Islam and the meaning of the Quran even? Is it possible to use the Bible as revelation for discussions with Muslims? Today, most Muslims would tell you, no, it's not possible. The reason for this is, according to Muslim teaching, is that the Bible has been corrupted by Christians and Jews, so that the text of the Bible is no longer reliable. This issue was one that puzzled Gordon Nickel, who is a scholar of Islam, a Western scholar of Islam. And Gordon, who is a Mennonite Christian, studied the issue of the Quran and noticed that in the early history of Islam, there were debates between Muslims and Christians where the Muslims regarded the Bible as revelation and authoritative and didn't raise questions about whether the Bible had been corrupted or not. In fact, the verses in the Quran that suggest that the Bible was corrupted by Christians and Jews were interpreted not that the text of the Bible itself was corrupted, but rather that in their preaching, Christians and Jews distorted the meaning of the Bible. And so Gordon Nickel has written a very important book for Christians in attempting to understand Islam called Narrative Tamperings in the Earliest Commentaries on the Quran. And there he discusses the history of Islamic interpretation of the Bible itself. This is a valuable book, but it's also a scholarly book. So Gordon's also written another book called The Gentle Answers, which goes through these things in a more popular vein for the ordinary Christian to read and to understand the relationship between the Bible itself and the Quran. Another issue about the Quran which most Muslims accept, some Muslims object to it and say this is not part of Islamic teaching, but the majority of Muslims accept the fact that there is such a thing as abrogation within the revelation of the Quran. That is, that God gave Muhammad certain revelations, and then later God changed those revelations. And the later revelations nullify the earlier revelations. So early in the Quran, there's talk about wine and things like this being drunk by Muslims, and then alcohol is banned by Muslims because the Muslim community got too drunk. And so God bans the use of alcohol. Although alcohol is going to be there in heaven. In heaven, one of the joys of heaven will be to enjoy wine. But on earth, Muslims are not to drink wine. And this, from an outside perspective, looks like something of a contradiction. The Quran itself says one thing, and then later it appears to say something else. But for Muslims it isn't, because the earlier revelations are abrogated because of the circumstances in which the Muslim community found itself. So the doctrine of abrogation shapes Muslim interpretation, and it shapes Muslim interpretation also in terms of the relationship of Islam to other religions. In the early revelations of the Quran, there's considerable tolerance of other religious traditions. In later revelations, Islam becomes much stricter, and the question is which of the revelations ought to guide the Muslim community today. And Muslims themselves argue about this, but when abrogation is applied, then it is the strict interpretation that is taken. When we come to looking at Islam, one of the other great problems is the problem of jihad. Historically, jihad was always understood as a war in defense of Islam and the Muslim community. Today, there's an interpretation, a very popular interpretation, that says there are two meanings of jihad. One is inner struggle, and the other is warfare. But the inner struggle is the primary meaning. And this interpretation of inner spiritual struggle being the primary meaning of jihad is in fact a very recent development within Islam. It's only in the mid-19th century that some members of the Ahmadiyya community claimed that they'd found hadith that taught this. And these hadith have now been taken up and used throughout the Muslim community to modify the interpretation of Islam. But other Muslims appeal back to the older interpretation and say, no, jihad is religious warfare in defense of Islam. Now, this also raises another tricky question. What do we mean by defense? Because sometimes the best defense is attack, and therefore jihad becomes a question of what does a defensive war mean? Does it involve a preemptive strike? So jihad is a troublesome issue in Islam, and there are a number of major studies of jihad that trace the history of jihad. And when we discuss jihad, we need to look at the studies, look at the historical context, the historical teaching of Muslims, and what many Muslim writers say about jihad. The majority of Muslim writers who are not living in Western countries, and even many who live in Western countries, say that jihad was primarily a defensive war. But a small minority who are very vocal in the West say, no, jihad is a spiritual struggle. But that is not the dominant view throughout most of the Muslim world. And this is something we must realize and come to terms with, because it is an important point if we are to have meaningful discussions with Muslims. When we think about this issue, it brings us directly to the question of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. In the Western world, Osama bin Laden is often described in the press as an extremist, as a fanatic, as someone who's not really a good Muslim. This is not the way Osama bin Laden is viewed in most Muslim countries. In Pakistan, for example, one can buy little toys of Osama bin Laden for children to play with because he's a hero. And why is he a hero? Because Osama bin Laden is seen as someone who attempted to defend Islam from destruction by the West. And this is something Christians need to grasp. If you go to a country like Pakistan, if you go to many countries throughout the world, Western television is beamed down from satellites. And in small villages in the back of beyond, people watch television. And on television, they see scantily dressed women running around. They see people having affairs. They see all sorts of things which go against Islamic morality. And seeing these things was seen by bin Laden and is seen by other Muslims as an attack upon Islam. Therefore, when bin Laden organized Al-Qaeda and when he attacked the Twin Towers, it was because he believed Islam was under attack by the West. The West was destroying Muslim values. It was destroying Muslim culture. It was destroying Muslim society. It was undermining it through immorality. And so he is defending Islam. We're not going to agree with what he did. What he did was evil. But on the other hand, we mustn't dismiss him as a fanatic and as someone who was not a good Muslim. What we've got to understand is why he did what he did and what he was thinking in attacking the Twin Towers. And what he was thinking was that he was defending Islam. He was defending Islam against a corrupt and decadent West that was destroying society, that was leading people away from God into the ways of evil. So he saw the West as evil, and an evil that had to be stopped. And this is why he acted, and why his followers act in the way they do. They're fighting for the survival of Islam in their own minds.